With our new understanding of skin structure and skin patterns fresh in our minds, we can begin the fun detailing stage. And I do enjoy this process a lot. I think you probably will too. I hope you will at least. But I need to kind of get my workspace in order because we need to set up our tools to facilitate a more efficient stamping workflow. So I'm just going to run through a list of things to get in order. Number one, we don't need this blue material on our head anymore. So I'm going to select it and remove that temporary retopology material. Remember, that was only there to distinguish the sculpture from the retopo. And next, I'm going to drag out a window on the right side, taking up about 1/3 to 1/4. And this is going to be an image editor where we're going to load a new reference image called Skin Detail. Okay, you can find that in your reference folder as well. A lot of the same photos we've already looked at with some additional ones, very high resolution, giving us the ability to quickly reference pore detail. And then I will split this window so that on the bottom will also be an image editor, but this is where we can see the stamps that we're about to load. Now, when it comes to the stamps, it's a little bit of a funky process, but we're going to create a custom brush that will be the home to our stamps. And so we will switch, make sure we have our head selected, switch to sculpt mode. And you can make any of these brushes use a texture where the individual behavior of the brush can be influenced by a texture. However, for kind of a standard stamping method, we're going to base that off of the typical draw brush. All right, this is kind of the baseline sculpting brush. And the way we're going to create a custom brush is select the draw brush. And up here at the top, you see where it says Sculpt Draw. You can think of this button as kind of a container of brushes where we can actually create new textures. We can populate this box full of various textures, but you can't do that up here in the tool shelf. Where we're going to have to do that is over here in the tool properties, the expanded tool properties. And just like textures or object data or materials, we have the ability to add a fake user. It tells us how many users are using this brush and also the ability to create a new one. So let's duplicate this brush and rename it to Stamp. And now we should see that update up here in the tool shelf. And in this brush, we can change settings like adding a texture. So let's create a new texture. And I'm going to name this skin_pores. Capital A, and I'll explain the naming as we go. For mapping, I'm going to choose area plane, and then for stroke, we're going to use the anchored stroke method. Now, there's all kinds of possibilities for how you can use various stroke methods and mapping methods for stamping the surface, but I'm only going to stick to one because it delivers the best results in my experience, and that is the anchored stroke approach. If you're coming from ZBrush, the workflow will be familiar to you. And I think that's all we need to change within the brush settings. Now, we've created the texture, but we haven't plugged in our image. So I'm going to switch over to the texture properties, and Blender's smart enough to realize we came from the brush. So we're looking at the brush texture, and we just need to open our stamp textures. And let's see if we can open them all at the same time. I'll hit the A key and we'll open those images. Now I should be able to see all of them. Okay, so we've got them all loaded into Blender, but the one that I want to be assigned to Pores A specifically is going to be Pores Big. And now if we look at Skin Pores Big by itself, hit the, let's see, Home key on our keyboard to center the image. And this is going to be our primary texture that we're going to use most often. It's our orange peel texture. Now, when it comes to stamps, they're simple black and white images where black values have no effect on the brush and white values have full effect. And so that's kind of the spectrum. So here, the black spots representative of pores will not push out from the surface of our sculpture, but all these gray values and brighter values will push out. And so that's kind of how stamping works. That's why all of these textures are black and white. And so this will give us the effect of holes sticking into the surface. So Control Space to minimize that window. And let's do a test stamp on our sculpture. Now, very important, the undo stack in Blender is pretty funky at this point in time. I'm using Blender 2.90.1. And I guess just to illustrate what I mean, if I were to make a stroke and, oh, I don't like that, hit Control Z, Blender is going to hang for a second, and you're going to notice some settings. Well, you might notice some settings that disappear. Once it finishes, it actually steps backwards and undoes some of these settings that we set. So let's go back to our brush setting and make sure we've got area plane, we've got anchored, and what did it change? Let's see, skin pores big, that's correct. Okay, maybe we got away with it. This problem is so frustrating because it's hard to diagnose, but basically what I want to recommend is whenever you change brush settings and you're ready to actually start stamping, make a very small stamp. All right, so click and drag ever so slightly so that it technically counts as an operation, but we haven't actually changed anything. Okay, so now if I wanted to make another stroke, I can undo and it happens right away. Whereas if you see the undo lag, it means it's undoing some of your settings. And I'm certain you'll see me mess this up at some point. It's a very frustrating way the system works, but it's just one of the things we have to deal with at this point in time. One of the things you should have noticed, if we do that again, is that the resolution is too small. So we need access to our modifier, our multi-res modifier. Let's undo that. And I'm going to drag out another window down here and make this our modifier panel. Okay, so we want to have consistent access to the modifier as well as our brush settings. So you'll see me jumping back and forth between these two. And currently we're at 524,000 faces. And that's nowhere near enough for the level of detail that we need. We need to start subdividing up. And you really want to be in between the 10 million and 15 million range in order to capture this detail. And so at a level of 4, we're at 1 million. Level 5, we should be around 3 to 4 million. And then we need to go up to, it should be about 12 million, 13 million, somewhere in there. Okay, yeah, 13,200,000. This is definitely where you'll find out if your computer is capable of this kind of detail. I know my computer, frankly, barely handles it with screen recording going on, but you really need to be in this 13 million range. It's really quite workable when I'm not screen recording. You can see in the viewport, like we're hopping around pretty quick. One thing that I do like to turn off right away, you'll notice that our sculpture, as we orbit around, it's kind of flickering in its topology, and that's due to this setting in the options, fast navigate. For when we orbit around the viewport, it de-reses the subdivision level just for the sake of efficiency. I'm going to turn that off because I find that fairly annoying, and it works fine without it, at least on my computer. But now that we're up to almost 14 million polys, or I guess really closer to 13 million, let's draw a stamp and see how it performs. All right, so it's a little bit laggy, but it's workable. And I know that improvements are being worked on right now to make this even more workable, but we are maxing out Blender's capability, all right? We're not using ZBrush, which can go into the billions of polygons. It will only continue to improve, but just understand that we're working at the ceiling of Blender's capabilities. And of course, it's also the ceiling of your computer. So you're not going to be able to do this on a 2017 MacBook Pro, in other words. You need to have an upper mid to high-end PC to really get the performance out of Blender. But that is not actually what I wanted to do. Let's undo that. Okay, so we're taking a long time to undo. Part of this is the additional geometry, but also it's that issue where it's going to undo some of my settings. I'm not sure which ones, but I'm looking at the modifier. Okay, looks like we're fine. If we remember what that looked like, the depth was too strong. So really, for realistic pore detail, we want to hang out in the like 0.1 to 0.2 range of strength in our brush. So I'm going to go down to like 1.6 and try again and drag out a new stamp. Okay, that's also how the anchored brush works, or the anchored stroke method. You start from the center and kind of pull out. It will increase the size of the stamp as well as the intensity of the stamp. Now that, let's see, we'll look at a different reference face, this one that we started with. All right, so this one looks like the pores are a little bit too strong. Let's undo. And trust me, the undo is not this slow whenever you're doing sequential stampings. But I promise you, it's going back into the settings and it's changing some things, which can be a real hassle. One thing that I know it will have changed, my strength is back to 0.5, okay? So that's what I'm saying. Anytime you change a setting, like let's go down to 1 point, I actually think I need it a little bit stronger. Let's go to 0.2. I'm gonna draw a tiny stamp. So there's really no effect, but it counts as an operation. It's so stupid that we have to do this, but trust me, it's gonna work better. Now, if I draw a stamp, okay, it's a little bit laggy drawing it, but I'm gonna draw a second one and then undo, and it's immediate. All right, so this first stamp I think is good in terms of depth, in terms of size. So I found a good medium point, and we can start drawing stamp after stamp. That's how the workflow is going to go. And because we did that gradient, or there's a gradient in the texture, we get a nice fall off, which allows us to kind of layer these stamps one next to the other, one on top of each other. And we can just start dragging one by one. I know it might seem crazy that, are we seriously going to drag one by one over the entire head? And for the most part, yes. So if you thought it was going to be faster than this, sorry to disappoint, but this texture is going to work great for the majority of the cheek. In fact, we're going to carry this texture through the cheek and the nose before we really switch to another texture. And you want to be aware of not being inconsistent. Well, I would say don't be too inconsistent with your stamp sizes. A part of the benefit of doing it this way one by one is that there is going to be a little bit of a variety, and that is going to naturally lend itself to an organic nature, which is good, a very good thing to include in our sculpture. So that's another reason why I recommend this approach instead of a procedural tiled stamp approach, because that's going to look way too uniform, way too consistent. Now, as I'll kind of leave off the cheek there and make my way into the nose. And this is where we're going to want to turn off symmetry eventually. You can see the other side of the nose, the blue dot representative of the mirror stroke. And once we get to the middle, we do not want to be mirroring that anymore because it's going to be very obvious at the horizon of symmetry. But I think right about now, I'll turn off symmetry and just go one by one. And I think that also turning off symmetry increases the performance a little bit as well. But I promise you, the screen capture is making this worse than it actually is. If you're watching this thinking this is not workable, it's definitely not as workable as a ZBrush, and hopefully not as workable as it will be in the near future with the improvements that Pablo is making. But, the alternative is you just aren't able to do this with Blender. If this is not workable, then you're going to have to stop the project. And for me, it's workable enough, and the result and what it's capable of is worth kind of persevering through the slowness. So now we're getting to the nostrils, and I think I'll turn symmetry back on. So for this first pass, I'm going to try and use symmetry as much as possible without making it obvious, because, we're going to put several layers of stamps by the end of this process. And the first one is going to be okay to use the symmetry more than not. But it's kind of a constant battle trying to remember when symmetry is on and when it's not. Thankfully, we have that blue dot, or the mirror dot, that kind of shows this visually. For many years in Blender, that wasn't the case. Okay, here I need to turn it off. Draw the pores over top of the nose, the bridge of the nose. And this is a pretty flexible process, I will say, in that I don't have to be terribly meticulous with exactly what these pores look like. See, that last stroke was a little bit bigger in terms of the pore size, but that's okay because I can go over it and around it and gradually taper off the size. If you mess up and you really don't like it, obviously hit Control Z, but really you can also smooth. You can hold Shift and smooth out an area and then just go over it again. Each stamp is not a make or break it situation. And I'm going to stop there with the nose. One technique that I highly recommend you employ is varying the stretching of the texture. So in our brush texture settings, let's see where we at. This is the texture settings. So I want to go to the brush settings. Towards the top, you'll see the size X, Y, and Z option. Now, if we change the X to 0.5, you'll notice that our texture is now stretched horizontally, basically perpendicular to the direction that we pull our anchored stroke from. And this is very useful because especially around creases, around the eyelids, there's actually a flow to the pores, right? You can probably tell that the wrinkles and pore detail right here kind of flows in this direction, right? Once we get to the nasolabial fold, the pores ever so slightly stretch out, right? Also here, they're kind of stretched in this direction. All right, now this is affected by the expression on the face, but it really does help to breathe a little bit of life into the pore detail to stretch them out as you enter into crevices and, really just according to the reference, wherever you see it happening in the reference. You don't really want to leave it unstretched the whole time. It's going to look less realistic. So for example, I'm going to actually change the size to 0.7. I don't want it to be that stretched. And let's drag it out down the nasolabial fold. All right, so the direction that I want the pores to be stretched is perpendicular to my brush stroke. And that might be a little bit too stretched still, like 0.8, even just a little bit of stretching. And the variety that will come with that is going to be worth it. All right, so I'm going to make it kind of follow the shape of the cheek here as it circles around towards the chin. Also, you'll notice that I'm pulling outward in the same direction, which means it's the same stamp pattern. So if I pull the other direction, it's just going to introduce a little more variety. All right, so sometimes sort of like a retopology, whenever I'm, extruding a string of verts in a certain direction, I'll also try and do that with a slightly stretched stamp pattern and then fill in around it, gradually getting back to a more neutral stamp. So at this point, we'll go back to 1, so it's no longer stretched, and kind of fill in this space. Trying to be cognizant of which direction I'm pulling out, sometimes changing up the direction. And when it's not stretched, you can go any direction you want, pull it up, down, left or right, whatever. But I did just notice that I have symmetry turned off. This is kind of a bummer because I made a lot of stamp strokes and it means I'll have to make those to the other side too. It's a little bit less efficient. I mean, I can't finish the stamping as fast if I'm not using symmetry, but in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking asymmetry at this stage is only a benefit to the final result. It's not a benefit to the workflow, but it will benefit the final render, and every bit of symmetry risks being unrealistic. So it's okay that that happened. What I usually will do then is, especially for the side of the cheeks, like you're never going to see both cheeks clearly at the same time. So that's an obvious candidate to enable symmetry. And I'll just kind of remember that there's a patch on the other side I'll have to fill out. And I'll have to do that asymmetrically, but it's going to be fine. Again, it's a pretty flexible process. You can also kind of vary if you want the depth. An extra level of detail is that here on the cheek, the pores are a little bit stronger than they might be on the cheek. And so just ever so slightly tweaking the depth, like going to maybe 2.5, maybe 2.7. Let's see how this looks. Right, so the pores get a little bit deeper. Now, I should have done that on the cheek, but that's okay. I can increase that depth with, let's try with an inflate brush. Okay, so if you want to kind of exaggerate the effect of the stamp, let's go to inflate and use a low strength and just touch on this area. That looks like it's a little too low. Okay, so you can see as I circle around, the stamp is collapsing in on itself, especially the pore area. So that's a little too strong, but that is how we can increase the effect in there. Something else you might be thinking is, with these stamps, aren't we changing the surface of the skin and adding more volume? Technically, yes, that is what's happening, but I don't find it to be that noticeable in as much to change the underlying structure of the broad facial shape, but that's also dependent on a balanced stamp strength. So if I go back to like a point, let's say 0.3 or 4 value of the stamp, you'll see that it's looking like a bump, right? we have really deep pores, but also more exaggerated push out. And so that does not look very good. But it also helps to have kind of balanced stamp textures. And I've used these plenty before and they work quite well. So again, this 0.2 range, I think, is a sweet spot for this first skin texture stamp. And I think at this point, I'll stop this particular video. We're off to a good start. Now, if you're thinking, dude, that does not look realistic, I agree with you. And that is okay, because this is a first pass. And the power of this technique comes with progressive layering of stamps throughout the process. And this is just a first pass. It's only one texture, so it's not going to look realistic. But as we progress, as the stamps are layered, it's going to turn out really, really nice. So we will continue that process in the next lesson.